Most of us operate on a deeply ingrained assumption about progress, the belief that a better job, a newer car, or the latest technology will secure our lasting happiness. Yet, despite pocket-sized supercomputers and instant access to global supply chains, baseline levels of human happiness have remained stagnant for decades. This gap between expectation and reality leads to a specific kind of exhaustion. We find ourselves trapped in social competition for status, our minds troubled by an endless longing for the next upgrade. This modern suffering stems from a hardwired glitch in the way human beings assign value to the world around them. Roughly 2,500 years ago, a Chinese philosopher named Lao Tzu documented this psychological flaw in the 3rd chapter of the Daodejing. While often read as poetry, Chapter 3 serves as an early observation of social behavior, one that identifies how specific cultural incentives trigger individual anxiety. To understand our current state of burnout, we have to look backward and examine the structure of how we assign value. Chapter 3 opens with a set of direct conditional statements. If status is not praised, people will not quarrel. If treasures are not prized, people will not steal. If objects of desire are not displayed, people's hearts will not be troubled. The core teaching here is that value is created by judgment. An object only becomes a treasure because of the collective labels we attach to it. This creates a unique perspective on conflict. Think about it. An object no one values cannot be stolen, and a position no one covets creates no competition. Suffering arises from the meaning we assign to objects, rather than the objects themselves. By celebrating and displaying our desires, we actively manufacture the social conflict and individual anxiety we are trying to escape. The text offers an alternative approach for finding order, quieting the people's hearts and filling up their bellies, stilling their ambitiousness and strengthening their bones. This ancient prescription suggests meeting basic physical needs, security, shelter, and food, while intentionally removing the pressure of constant stimulation and ambition. Laozi calls this Wu Wei, or acting in alignment with nature. It's the practice of doing what naturally needs to be done, rather than forcing artificial desires. Personal and societal order prevail naturally only when we stop actively creating the conditions for desire. While these ideas are ancient, modern science has recently begun to quantify the exact biological mechanisms Laozi described. Psychology calls this phenomenon hedonic adaptation, and it explains why our satisfaction with new things is so fleeting. The mechanism is a loop. Getting what you want provides a short spike in satisfaction, but within weeks, your brain returns to its previous baseline state. Satisfaction fails to compound with more possessions. Instead, our expectations simply rise, forcing us to chase something more expensive just to maintain the same level of happiness. Recent consumer research confirms that acquiring more does not produce lasting happiness, aligning with Laozi's claim that prizing treasures eventually troubles the heart. This graph illustrates the ultimate consequence of this psychological bug. It tracks a satisfaction gap in modern AI adoption, comparing the exponential growth of technical capability in blue against stagnant user satisfaction in red. While AI capability scales at a breakneck speed, human perception follows the Weber-Fechner law. Our satisfaction grows only logarithmically, resulting in diminishing returns despite massive technical progress. Even the temporary spikes on the red line show that breakthroughs only provide a moment of excitement before our expectations reset. We adapt to miracles almost instantly. Our modern approach is to try and outrun our own biology by creating more desires to feed the treadmill. The Daoist approach is to recognize the treadmill as an illusion and to find order by simply stepping off. We live with greater physical wealth and technological abundance than any generation in history. Simultaneously, clinical rates of anxiety and isolation are at record highs. Around 2,500 years ago, philosopher Lao Tzu predicted this in the Daodejing. In Chapter 3, he presented a thesis. If treasures are not prized, people will not steal. If objects of desire are not displayed, people's hearts will not be troubled. We are treating this ancient philosophical claim as a modern scientific hypothesis. By applying the latest clinical data from 2024 and 2025,
we will subject Lao Tzu's premise to a rigorous modern peer review. Clinically, materialism is a rigid value system where self-worth depends entirely on acquiring possessions. It ties individual happiness directly to the accumulation of things. A 2025 study of employees in Pakistan plotted this materialistic drive against life satisfaction.
The data reveals a direct inverse correlation. As a person's focus on acquiring material wealth increases along the horizontal axis, their satisfaction with life drops sharply on the vertical axis. The damage extends to our social lives. A 2025 meta-analysis of 72 studies found that materialism damages a person's social integration and relationships even more than it impacts their individual well-being. Prioritizing physical treasures actively dismantles the human community required for peace. Our brains are wired with a mechanism called the hedonic treadmill. We rapidly return to a baseline level of happiness regardless of what we acquire, adjusting almost instantly to our new normal. This graph illustrates the earnings plateau. Wealth increases happiness initially, but abruptly flattens once basic security is met. To fight these diminishing returns, consumerism triggers a dopamine cycle. Purchases cause a sharp temporary mood spike, followed by an immediate crash back to the exact baseline. Because of our neurological wiring, pursuing more is a mathematically flawed strategy for sustaining well-being. Laozi understood this trap, warning that the specific danger lies in the display of objects of desire. Modern clinical data now confirms the mechanism. A 2025 Nature Medicine study found that exposure to curated, idealized lifestyles on platforms like Instagram correlates directly with an epidemic of depression and low self-esteem in young adults. This diagram shows the social comparison trap. The display of status triggers a comparison, causing a sense of relative deprivation, the feeling that we lack something essential. This results in intense anxiety and loneliness, driving the desire for more status to close the gap. The constant broadcasted display of status in modern culture functions as a toxic psychological trigger, ensuring our hearts remain troubled. There is a validated alternative called voluntary simplicity. This is an intentional choice to reduce consumption, distinct from the deprivation of forced poverty. A 2024 study by Jane and colleagues proved choosing simplicity aligns daily actions with core values. This replaces the temporary hits of consumer dopamine with a sense of lasting inner serenity. Research from the University of Otago identifies the primary driver of this happiness. By removing the focus on material accumulation, we create the psychological space for social connection to multiply and strengthen between people. Intentionally stepping off the hedonic treadmill is the only empirically proven way to restore the deep social bonds that materialism destroys. The consumer cycle of manufacturing desire, displaying it, and experiencing temporary happiness is proven to fail. The data-backed alternative, meeting basic needs, practicing gratitude, and refusing to display status, yields stable, long-term contentment. These modern, empirical truths lead back to the exact wording of the Daodejing. Stop prizing treasures, and the heart finds quiet. Laozi authored an exact psychological survival guide for the modern mind. It took science 2,500 years to finally gather the data to prove him right. We are taught that praising status drives progress, but the ancient Daodejing offers a sharp warning. Public celebration of status is the root of social quarreling and collective suffering. This isn't a vague philosophical warning. It is a description of a biological mechanism that modern psychology has finally mapped out. Researchers call this the social comparison chain. It begins with an upward comparison, looking at someone perceived as higher status. This triggers relative deprivation, which leads to obsessive rumination and eventually results in social anxiety. Notice the second step, relative deprivation. This shows that status anxiety can affect anyone regardless of their absolute wealth, because the psychological pain is triggered by the gap between where you are and where others appear to be. When a system relies on the public ranking of status, it guarantees psychological friction. It turns communities into arenas of constant comparative anxiety. This structural model from a 2021 study reveals that rising economic inequality directly fosters a competitive climate. This climate is the primary engine driving chronic status anxiety, focusing minds on social ladder position at the expense of societal cohesion. Once that hierarchy is heavily enforced, two more fractures appear: social withdrawal, as people isolate themselves to avoid judgment, and class resentment, as the distance between ranks becomes a source of humiliation. The very hierarchy designed to motivate individuals ends up fragmenting the society. Winners are left isolated by their success, and losers are left humiliated by the display of it. In ancient times, a person's status was limited to their immediate village. Today, digital platforms have amplified the scale of status display a millionfold. We have shifted toward quantified status. Human worth is now reduced to hard metrics: follower counts, likes, and viral reach that are visible to everyone all the time. This data visualization shows exactly what happens when our brains process those metrics. A social media notification triggers the exact same neurological reward pathways as a winning pull on a slot machine. We are subjecting our ancient brains to a constant, engineered amplification of a destructive social comparison loop. The toll of this comparison is physiological. Medical research from 2025 demonstrates that status anxiety is a biological crisis that elevates baseline cortisol and chronically disrupts sleep. The stress of constant status striving causes cellular damage. Specifically, it physically shortens telomeres, the protective caps on our DNA, resulting in accelerated biological aging. As materialism increases, social bonds weaken. We are left simultaneously more competitive for status and more isolated within our own communities. Modern consumer capitalism relies on this biological feedback loop, keeping us on a treadmill of anxiety to drive continuous consumption. This brings up a central concern. If we stop praising status and ranking success, won't human progress halt? Psychology distinguishes between extrinsic motivation, chasing titles and money, and intrinsic motivation, which is the drive for mastery, curiosity, and helping others. Meta-analyses show that while extrinsic drivers lead to burnout, intrinsic motivation produces higher achievement, greater creativity, and more sustainable mental health over time. Sociological data supports this. Nations with flatter status hierarchies consistently report lower rates of violent crime and higher overall well-being. They do not require rigid competition to thrive. Human excellence doesn't require a hierarchical treadmill. It requires alignment with our actual values and the mastery of our craft. Laozi's remedy for a status-obsessed society is fourfold: quiet the people's hearts, fill their bellies, still their ambitiousness, and strengthen their bones. Today, this means limiting our reliance on status metrics, ensuring basic human needs are met as rights, rejecting extrinsic validation, and building community resilience. This leads to the core principle of the text, Wu Wei, often translated as non-forced action. Wu Wei is not passive resignation. It is a highly active form of engagement, where you align your effort with your actual needs, rather than exhausting yourself chasing artificial status symbols. Removing the public display of status doesn't eliminate human excellence. It simply strips away the anxiety, leaving us finally free to flourish.